Rama Lakshmi. I'm here with Gyanpreet Award winning novelist, public intellectual, and a passionate advocate of climate, Amitav Ghosh. And we are here to launch his new book called Wild Fiction Essays. And it's a soft cover launch, and the book is published by HarperCollins. Welcome, Amitav. It's great after 3 decades.
Thank you, Rama. Yes, great to see you again.
Yeah. So I loved your book. The book is it's a thrilling collection of his long form nonfiction essays, his speeches, even his correspondence with a scholar, Dipesh Chakravarti. It's got some fascinating insights, especially a line I want to begin with. You say you're writing about a world, or we're living in a world of contending beliefs, unyielding borders, and unattainable visas. You were literally describing January 2025 as Trump, threatens to throw back tens of thousands of illegal immigrants who are stuck there. What do you have to say to them? You said the illegal migrants are mostly pursuing a dream of a better life, and the better life is nothing more than a meaningless marketing slogan. Would you still say that to them while they're sitting at the border waiting to be deported?
Yes, I would really, because you can't say this for everyone, and I think the circumstances are really different in the Americas. I mean, there's been the United States itself has caused so much chaos in Latin America and in Central America that there's incredible political mayhem. Also, there are major climate impacts. So a lot of people are truly desperate who are on that border. But in fact, a very large number, a percentage of the new arrivals are from the Indian subcontinent. And I think those cases are different. So from the Indian subcontinent, we have a very large number of Gujaratis and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis coming through Mexico. And at the same time, there are Gujaratis who enter from Canada. And some of them, as you will know, they freeze to death on the border. They make these very dangerous journeys with their children. I mean, it's just inconceivable what they're doing, really. Freezing to death on the border. I mean, is that your sense of a better life?
And yet now we call it illegal, but migration has always been there in history, in ancient history. But what is it about this current wave of history that you say is a symptom of a broken system?
Uh, people are always looking for causes of migration, and that often makes them think of terms like climate migration. So are these people being pushed away by climate or because of climate impacts or environmental impacts? Now, I, like many other, especially people who are aware of the situation on the ground, we don't, we tend not to use that term in a simplistic sense, because actually these kinds of migrations are spurred by many things other than simply environmental impacts. Uh, you know, uh, in my essay in this book, Wild Fictions, I've written about the role of communications technologies, especially cell phones, in empowering and enabling these migrations. And they play a very, very large part in it. I mean, it's through the cell phone that migrants pay their dalals. It's through the cell phone that they discover where they want, where they can go, where the ports are open, where they can, find an entry point. And there are many things many other things that drive this migration. For example, there are all these trafficking networks, which make it possible for people to move on such a large scale. And these trafficking networks are immensely wealthy. I mean, trafficking in people today is the most lucrative clandestine commerce on earth. I mean, more even than drugs. So they have enormous amounts of money at their disposal. And no matter where you go, if you have so much money, you can create structures of corruption. And I think this is happening very much, both in Europe and in America.
And you talk about uh, the heroic journeys many of them undertake, and you say they see themselves as heroes, their families see themselves as heroes because they've made these arduous, really death-defying journeys. And yet, when they reach these Western democracies, because of the liberal political establishment, you say they have to plead victimhood as if they're people without any agencies. Would you is is that a fair assessment, especially for people who are obviously, not all of them are fleeing persecution or climate, but they have reached the border, they're going to be deported back now, or they're being threatened to be deported back. How would you see them now, victims or heroes?
The answer lies somewhere in between because, you know, even those of them who are genuinely heroic in the sense that they've taken on this incredible challenge, they've lived through these terrible dangers, they've confronted really murderous gangs and so on. And yet, at the same time, they're victims of their own fantasies. I mean, they're victims of a fantasy created by the circulation of images on social media and on the internet. If you think about what the internet valorizes, what the advertising industry valorizes, what are the images that are presented to these kids? I mean, suppose you're a kid in a village, and your day is spent laboring in the rice fields, doing this horrible work in the extreme heat, while your cousin is sending you pictures of him posing beside, some fancy car in Europe. Obviously it's going to generate certain desires in you. You're going to think, well, why am I doing this? Why am I not doing that? So there is nothing really on social media or on the internet that valorizes or in any way makes those rural people feel seen. That makes them feel that their lifestyle also has a value, that it's an important thing, that tending to the land, that the land is beautiful. None of those things have any kind of value anymore.
And you
So
make
that's
this.
why,
Yeah, go ahead, finish your thought.
yeah. So, naturally they're drawn to these other alternatives.
Right. And when you talk about cell phones, somebody sitting in a village with a cell phone, you make this really jaw-dropping observation, and it just blew me away. And I'm going to read that line. Digital revolution has broken the long-standing link between affluence, education, and technical ability. It's just such a powerful. I mean, it's so obvious, but it's such a powerful observation to link the two. That is, for the first time, it has actually broken that link. Um, um, what troubles you about this phenomenon?
Well, I wouldn't say that it necessarily troubles me. I think it's fantastic that, young kids with very minimal education, are so adept at using the cell phone. Even illiterate people, because, voice-enabled commands have completely revolutionized the use of the use of communications technologies by illiterate people. So you'll see that many women who don't know how to read and write, for example, they're absolutely fluent in using this kind of communications technology. This is something I think that the West doesn't understand. Donald Trump, during his first presidency, he made this really hilarious statement saying, cell phones, why have they got cell phones? Take away their cell phones. And he doesn't seem to realize that the entire phenomenon is created and enabled by cell phones. It's not like these people are coming out of some a distant jungle, having never seen contemporary life. So my argument is that we shouldn't talk about climate migration. The same things that are driving greenhouse gas emissions are also driving these migrations. And that is this great acceleration, in the circulation of images, in the circulation of technology, in the circulation of information. So they're all cognate phenomena,
Right.
all ultimately linkable to the enormous increase in consumption and production that's happened across the world over the last 30 years.
And let's talk a little bit about the fact that the doors in the West are now shutting down at a time when the West is also grappling with baby bust and a shrinking youthful workforce. They need migrants, right? But that's when the door is coming down. What do you think is the future of this overheated anti-immigration politics?
It's it's completely contradictory, because on the one hand, it's not just Western economies, mind you. It's also the economies in more affluent parts of India. There's so much feeling against migrants in Mumbai and in some parts of Maharashtra. But anyone who's been in India, who's been on the West Coast, will know that the entire working class of Goa, of Karnataka, of Kerala, now they're Bengalis. They're Bengalis, Jharkhandis, Uriyas. It's a very striking phenomenon. So over there in those parts of India as well, the work that the local people don't do manual labor anymore.
So these
You
are
know
contradictory forces, right?
exactly. And once one kind of work becomes associated with migrants, that becomes stigmatized for local people. They just won't do that work. So it's the same in America. It's the same in across Europe. I keep meeting, farmers in America, let's say of my age or, roundabouts. They always say that, when they were kids, when they were teenagers, over the summers, during the high school or whatever, they would work on the farm, they would pluck apples, or they would do some kind of paid labor on the farm. They say now no native-born American will do that work anymore. They would, their summer jobs tend to be in Walmart or something, covered spaces. So, that kind of work has become absolutely stigmatized. So, similarly, in Italy, for example, all the back, the back of the restaurant work is completely done by immigrants. Similarly, on the fields, the work is done by immigrants. So, if they do ever actually shut out migrants, there's going to be a huge pushback from their own industries. This has already started in the US in the agricultural sector, because I've seen recently that migrants are not turning up at farms because they're afraid of being deported. And this means that the farms are actually facing a major crisis. I don't know how this is going to be resolved, but it's this whole policy is founded upon crazy contradictions.
Founded upon fear, really, right? Fear of the other.
It's much more than fear. Uh, I think the Western world is suddenly recognizing that the pattern of development that it fostered over the last many decades is now collapsing. It's facing absolute collapse. I mean, and climate change is one aspect of it, but there are many other reasons for that collapse. Spread of new pathogens. I mean, I think we are only now, we won't see the end of the consequences of the COVID pandemic for a very long time. But one thing we can already see is that it's been a very profoundly destabilizing factor in world politics. And I think we're going to see these consequences mount for, who knows, for decades. I mean, what will happen when the COVID generation kids come into the workforce? Not just in the US, but also here. My friends who are teachers here all tell me that the COVID generation kids who come into their classes are deeply traumatized and find it very hard to cope with certain things. In the United States, I hear even more of that. So, we are looking at a very, very uncertain future. And I think this recognition is slowly dawning on the West. And it's creating, as you say, fear, uncertainty. People don't know what lies ahead. Capitalism is founded on the promise of insurance. So, and insurance is founded upon the promise of a future. And when that future disappears, everything, it takes everything else with it.
You talk about complete collapse in one of your speeches in India. You spoke about complete collapse, and in the book you talk about how the moment has come where we must abandon this pursuit of perpetual, this paradigm of endless perpetual growth. So you're really advocating degrowth, some kind of
Yeah.
slowing down. Is that even fair? Is that possible to turn the clock back? Is that even fair? And is this a Gandhian goal? Because you say the West has to bring down its aspirational consumer and conspicuous consumerist lifestyle, uh, almost telling them to live Gandhian frugal lives, Spartan lives, not consume blindly. Are you turning the clock back? And is that possible? And is that fair?
What would be the best case scenario is if people who have very low standards of living and people who have very high standards of living could meet somewhere in the middle, where there's a shared standard of living. Is that going to happen? Well, I don't think so.
But your appeal is to the West to change its ways, not so much
Yes.
to the global South, but you're saying my appeal is to the global North to change its behavior.
Well, if you ask any person in the global South, if you say to them, well, look, you're being very badly hit by climate change impacts. Don't you think you should shrink your carbon footprint? And I've said this. I've said this experimentally in many places in India, in Indonesia, in Africa. Uh, what is the answer that you get back? The answer is always, why should we shrink our carbon footprint? They, expanded their carbon footprint and grew rich when we were poor and weak. Now it's our turn. So, in some sense, what is happening here is something mimetic. It's a thing where people are trying to copy other people, where there's a kind of envy for what they have, And this is a very crushing thing because, on the one hand, it means that there's an absolute determination to get all those things, no matter, how destructive they are. I mean, 30 years ago, that Indians would aspire to a three-car household. I mean, it was inconceivable, right? But now it's absolutely the reality in the cities. Uh, so obviously, what we absolutely, but there's also something very positive about this because it means that if you want to copy other lifestyles, if you think those other lifestyles are the perfect lifestyles, if that's what you envy, then if those people who you are copying change their lifestyles, then then it creates a whole stream of downstream effects, and people would also, I think, valorize different lifestyles then.
Mm. So some call you an advocate of the West in India, Western ideas of this climate change and bringing down consumption, and some in India think that you are no. Some in the West think you're an advocate of the global South in the West. Whose case are you arguing?
See, simply because of my peculiar subject position, I'm one of the very few who actually sees both ends. What it is in the global South and what it is in the global North. And it's in many ways a very unenviable position to be in because, I see people I respect and like advocating what they call solutions. And being a person from the global South, you know that this is not going to work. I mean, it's not even realistic. It has nothing, it's, I mean, the very idea that they have in the West, most of all in the United States, that the United States somehow has the future of the planet in its hands. This is not the case. I mean, it's an absolute delusion. I mean, it's the growth of the carbon footprint of China, India, and Indonesia that has now become the major driver of greenhouse gas emissions. This is no longer in the hands of the West. I mean, any kind of so-called solution in order to go forward would have to carry the global South with it.
And yet, just 4 days ago, we heard about drill, baby, drill. We heard about EV mandates. We heard about a walk back from Paris climate goals, basically leaving many countries in the world fend for yourself if you want climate goal pursuits, if you want to pursue climate change goals. Um, and yet, in your book, you talk about how climate change has become a buzzword in grant proposals, in looking for aid, Western aid. It's become like a thing that you have. It's like a masala, you say. I think you add into your proposals. Um, uh, so you're not even saying that these solutions, so-called solutions, mitigation, offsets, all these are not the problem. You're going back to the roots, change your behavior, change your consumption behavior. That's where you're going. You're really attacking the root. You're not looking at, lipstick on a pig window dressing solutions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The masala thing is actually, it's from a book by a very brilliant young anthropologist called Camelia Diwan, who's written about Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a kind of laboratory of climate solutions, so to speak. So that's where the NGOs use, this language very freely of what is it? You add climate onto anything and suddenly the purse strings open. And this is the sad thing that's happened, actually. The whole climate discourse has now been taken over on the one hand by climate entrepreneurs, who are making money out of it. And it's also been taken over by, in the voluntary sector by various NGOs and so on who, for their own reasons, pursue what they also see as solutions. But, being in the peculiar position that I'm in, I can see that these solutions are not going to work. I mean, the real problem with climate is that it's a planetary phenomenon. It manifests around the planet, but each of its manifestations on Earth are very local. So you have to be able to address those issues locally. For example, in California, for example, just the way that the mountains are structured, the way that the ridges send fire over them, that's something you have to take into account. You have to take into account seasonality. And then on top of that, climate change, which creates enormous variations in precipitation. So all of that becomes a part of the issue. I mean, these are local challenges, which in the end do have to be uh, addressed locally.
Let me come to the subject of fiction. You have passionately argued in the book that fiction, poetry, is the way, stories, these are the ways to fight this battle of biodiversity loss, of addressing non-human natural resources issues. And you talk about Mahashweta Devi, you talk about, Bon Bibi and Moby Dick. So my question is, Gayatri Spivak said, can the subaltern speak? Can the trees speak?
Um, well, trees do speak. We now know that. I mean, in fact, botanists have shown that trees communicate very extensively with each other. Yesterday, I was reading a book about a mushroom specialist, and mushrooms are very, very special creatures, I should say. And she can sense the presence of certain mushrooms long before she sets eyes on it, because the mushroom literally communicates with her. So the world around us is filled with all kinds of agency and subjectivity. It's just that most of us can't see it, but some people can.
So for
Uh,
writers, novelists, poets, the trees are the new subalterns?
Well, for some they are. I mean, for example, Richard Powers's book, The Overstory, and Shumona Rai, who also writes in English. She's been writing about uh, trees and plants and their communicative abilities. So, yeah, I mean, there are people who obviously are able in some way to communicate with these entities.
And you think more than nonfiction, fiction is the way to change?
See, we have to accept that we do live in stories whether we like it or not, you know. So, for example, Musk lives in stories that he read as a child, which I also read, about people fleeing to Mars and setting up a kind of, setting up space colonies in Mars. I remember reading Edgar Rice Burroughs. He used to write the Tarzan books, but he also wrote the stories about Mars. So science fiction writers have been writing this stuff for a long time, and it's had a profound impact, in fact, on the world. I mean, these ultra tech, these tech ultra billionaires, you can just see, as kids, they read a lot of science fiction, and it's worked its way into their heads.
And there's
And
now a whole genre called climate fiction. And in fact, one of my reporters in my environment team, she's working on a story about climate fiction for kids. There's this emerging genre there.
yes, there is that genre. Yeah.
I want to end by asking you a question. There's this beautiful, my favorite part in the book is your correspondence with Dipesh Chakravarti. It's
Okay.
just captivated. It's just so beautiful. And every word I consumed. But you ask a very important question about racism. Why is it that we do not talk about racism in under colonial period? We talk about subjugation, we talk about economic loot and plunder, but we do not talk enough about racism. And he calls it the silent question of the colonial rule. You obviously give some answers, possible answers, that maybe our parents who were chroniclers, who historians, were upper caste, so they didn't, that upper caste consciousness did not allow them to acknowledge that there was racism, and he came up with this. It's been several years since you had those letters, those email exchanges with Dipesh. Do you have an answer now to why racism doesn't feature in our stories about colonial rule?
Uh, I think in the end, it's exactly what Dipesh and I discussed. I mean, several other essays in the book are also centered around this question. And I think it is exactly that there's an element of caste in it. Since so many of these men were upper caste and privileged, they just didn't want to acknowledge that there's somewhere a glass ceiling which they can't get past. So that's that they are, they may come very close to the center of power, but they're never going to be within that center of power. And I think that hasn't changed. I think whether you're talking even about as powerful a man as Rishi Sunak, or someone like Kamala Harris, or even Barack Obama, uh, you know, but Barack Obama became president. There was all this talk about a post-racial moment. But in fact, in all these countries, there are these deep states which significantly constrain, even the apparently most powerful people within it. And I think that's what happened in both those cases, because we now see that far from achieving a post-racial moment, in fact, it created the conditions for an enormous backlash in America, with Trump, and it's coming in the UK as well. Nigel Farage is expanding his electoral base by leaps and bounds. I mean, he's going to take over the Conservative Party, and he's going to become the fulfillment of Enoch Powell's vision of, the political future. It's often said, that the most important British politician of the last 50 years was Enoch Powell with his racist ideas. Uh, you know, British governance was built on race for so long that it's very hard to see how they would be able to completely take it out of their conceptions of the world.
And one of the signs of this pushback that you talk about in the US is this new dismantling of DEI goals.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's one thing. Yesterday, I saw this really disturbing thing that in several states now, the Ku Klux Klan has come back in a very big way and is actually issuing these directives to to migrants to clear out before we come and get you. It's very, very disturbing. We just don't know what the future holds.
Yeah, and the very fact that Trump mentioned manifest destiny, that has so much of, old resonance of westward expansion. This land is
Yeah,
ours.
westward
And
expansion.
inevitability to this kind of mindset.
Exactly.
Well, Amitav Ghosh, thank you for this remarkable book and for your passion and prose. It was absolutely wonderful to talk to you after, or listen to you after 3 decades.
Thank you, Rama. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me.
Bye bye.